After my husband's funeral, my sister revealed her son was his child, then showed me his will. My name is Diane Whitfield. I am 44 years old. 3 hours after we lowered my husband into the ground, my sister stood in my kitchen holding a folded piece of paper like it was a winning lottery ticket. The funeral casseroles were still warm on the counter. My black dress still smelled like the incense from the church. Karen looked at me with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. She said, "Diane, sit down. There's something you need to know about Tyler, and something you need to see about the house." I sat down because my knees told me to, not because I wanted to. She told me her son, my 17-year-old nephew Tyler, was not my brother-in-law's child. He was Richard's, my husband's. Then she unfolded the paper and set it on the table between the ham sandwiches and the sympathy cards, and told me it was Richard's real will, signed 4 months before he died, and that it left the lake house and 40% of the business to Tyler. She said it so gently. She said it like she was doing me a favor by telling me before the lawyers did. I want you to remember that moment, because it matters later. Karen's hands were steady. Her voice did not shake. There was no grief in her eyes at all, only the flat patience of someone who has been waiting for a door to open. I looked at that paper and felt the floor tilt under me, and somewhere behind my ribs, a very old, very tired part of me thought, of course it's her. It's always her. But there was another part of me, smaller, newer, that went very quiet and very cold, and started counting. Before I tell you what that paper really was, and what I found in the 4 weeks that followed, and where Karen ended up sitting when the truth finally came out in a room full of witnesses, tell me something. Tell me what time it is where you are right now, and what city you're watching this from. I read every comment, and tonight I want to know who's sitting with me for this one. And if you've ever had a sibling smile at you while they were taking something that wasn't theirs, hit subscribe before you go any further, because you already know how this story is going to make you feel. I need to take you back before I take you forward. Karen is 2 years older than me. Growing up in our house outside Columbus, Ohio, she was the pretty one, the funny one, the one my mother introduced first at church. I was the responsible one, which is a nice way of saying I was the one nobody worried about, so nobody paid attention to either. When I was 11, our grandmother gave me a small gold locket before she passed and told me it was mine, only mine. Don't let anyone talk you out of it. Karen wanted it within a week. She cried in front of my mother, said it matched a memory she had of Grandma. More than I did, said I wouldn't even appreciate it the way she would. My mother looked at me and said, "Diane, you have so many nice things. Let your sister have this one." I gave it to her. I was 11. And I already understood the math of that house. That piece cost me something every single time, and Karen never had to pay a cent of it. When I was 26, I loaned Karen $4,000 to cover a security deposit and 2 months of rent after a breakup. She promised to pay it back within the year. She never mentioned it again. And when I brought it up once, gently, at a Thanksgiving dinner, she looked genuinely wounded, said she couldn't believe I would bring up money at a family dinner, said I was making her feel like a charity case in front of everyone. My mother sighed at me the way she always did, the sigh that meant, "Diane, why do you have to make things difficult?" I apologized to my own sister for asking to be repaid. I want you to sit with that for a second, because that sigh is the whole reason this story exists. That sigh taught me that the fastest way to be loved in my family was to disappear a little every time someone else wanted something of mine. There was another moment, smaller than the locket, smaller than the money, that I only understood the weight of years later. I was 17, the same age Tyler is now, and I had been accepted into a summer arts program 2 states away, the kind of program you apply for with a portfolio and wait months to hear back about. Karen wanted to go on a trip with friends that same week and needed our mother's car, the only car in the house that could make the drive, the same car that was supposed to take me to the bus station for my program. My mother told me the program would still be there next summer, that Karen's friends had already made plans, that it wasn't fair to disappoint a whole group of people. Over one bus ticket, I missed the program. Karen went on her trip and sent a single postcard that said, "Having so much fun. Wish you were here." And I remember reading it at the kitchen table and understanding, for the first time in a way I couldn't yet name, that in my family, my plans were negotiable, and Karen's were furniture. I told myself for years that none of these things mattered on their own. A locket, a loan, a bus ticket, because none of them were big enough to justify the word betrayal. It took losing my husband to understand that a pattern doesn't need one big moment to be real. It only needs enough small ones, stacked quietly, for long enough. Until one day, someone hands you a folded piece of paper and you realize the small moments were never separate stories at all. They were the same story, told over and over, and I had simply never let myself add them up. When I met Richard, I was 31 and tired in a way I didn't have words for yet. He was steady. He built commercial properties for a living, strip malls, small office parks, the unglamorous backbone of a growing suburb, and he liked that I never needed him to perform for me. We married quietly in a garden behind a restaurant, 60 guests, no drama, and for 13 years that was exactly what our life looked like. Steady, quiet, mine. Karen was always around the edges of it. She'd call Richard directly, sometimes instead of me, ask him for advice about a rental property she was managing, laugh a little too long at his jokes at family dinners, and I noticed it the way you notice a draft in an old house, a small cold spot you learn to walk around instead of fix. When Tyler was born 17 years ago, Karen told everyone the father was a man named Marcus, a contractor she'd dated for a few months and who conveniently moved to Arizona before the baby arrived and was never heard from again. I held that baby in the hospital and felt nothing but tenderness for him, because whatever his mother is, a child does not choose the mess he's born into. There was a moment 11 years ago that I buried so deep I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Came home early from a work trip and found Karen's car in our driveway at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, when Richard had told me he had client meetings all day. She said she'd stopped by to drop off a casserole dish she'd borrowed. There was no casserole dish anywhere in the house. I asked Richard about it that night, casually, the way you ask a question you're afraid to actually get an answer to. He said Karen had come by to ask him about refinancing her condo, that it was boring, that I shouldn't worry about it. I let it go, because letting it go was the only language my family had ever taught me. That is the last time in this story I will tell you I let something go. 2 weeks after the funeral, sitting at my kitchen table with that folded piece of paper still in a drawer where I'd shoved it, I finally let myself ask the question I had been avoiding for 11 years. What if that was never about a condo? I didn't cry when I asked myself that. I got a legal pad instead, and I started writing dates. That was the moment. Not the will, not even the paternity claim, but the quiet click of finally being willing to look directly at something I had spent a decade looking away from. I decided that night that whatever Karen thought this was going to be, a grieving sister who could be managed with soft words and old habits, that version of me had been buried along with my husband. The next morning, I called Richard's estate attorney, a careful, dry man named Preston Hale, who had handled our wills, our trust, and the paperwork for the business for 9 years. I did not mention Karen's paper on the phone. I only asked him to pull the original, executed will from his files and confirm it matched what he had on record. He told me the will he had was executed 3 years earlier, witnessed in his office, notarized by his own paralegal, and left everything, the house, the lake property, and Richard's 40% stake in Whitfield Commercial Properties to me, with no mention of any other beneficiary. I told him about the document Karen had shown me. There was a long pause on the line, the kind of pause a careful man takes before he says something he knows will change the shape of a family. He said, "Diane, bring me that paper and don't tell your sister you're doing it." I drove to his office that same afternoon with the folded page in a plastic sleeve because some instinct in me, some part that had apparently been paying attention this whole time, told me not to touch it with my bare hands more than I already had. Preston laid it next to the real will on his desk and started with the notary stamp. The seal on Karen's document listed a notary named Wendy Aldrich, commission number and all. He typed the commission number into the state notary database while I sat there holding my coffee like it was the only solid thing left in the room. The database returned an active commission, but the name attached to it was not Wendy Aldrich. It was a man named Curtis Boone, licensed in a county 2 hours away, a notary who, according to his own public complaint history, had been disciplined 18 months earlier for signing documents without the signer physically present. Someone had taken a real, valid commission number off a real notary's public seal and typed a different name over it. That is not a typo. That is forgery, and forgery leaves fingerprints if you know where to look. Preston recommended a forensic document examiner named Louise Farrow, a woman who had spent 22 years testifying in probate disputes before she went independent, and he warned me that hiring her meant this was no longer a family conversation, it was a legal one, and there would be no comfortable way to walk it back once it started. I told him I understood. I want you to notice something about what I did next, because it is the whole engine of everything that follows. I did not call Karen and scream at her. Did not post anything online. I did not confront her at her house with the paper in my hand, demanding answers in front of her neighbors. I picked up the phone and I built a file. Louise Farrow met me 3 days later in a small office that smelled like toner and old paper. She examined the will under raking light first, the kind of angled lighting that makes indentations and pressure marks visible on a page, and pointed out that Richard's signature on Karen's document had a slightly different baseline slant than his signature on 4 verified documents from the same year, bank forms, a car title, a homeowner's insurance renewal, all of which Preston had on file. She said forged signatures often get the shape right and the pressure wrong because a forger is copying an image, not writing the way the real person's hand naturally moves. She also found something under magnification that made her sit back in her chair for a second. The paper itself contained an optical brightener compound that, according to the manufacturer's own product records, was not introduced into that particular paper stock until 14 months after the date typed at the top of the will. In plain terms, the document claimed to be signed on a piece of paper that did not exist yet on the date. It claimed to be signed. Louise wrote all of this into a formal report with her license number and her signature at the bottom. The kind of report that means something in a courtroom, not just around a kitchen table. While Louise worked on the paper itself, I hired a private investigator named Marcus Delgado, a quiet, unhurried man Preston had used before, to build a simple, factual timeline of the 4 months before Richard died. Nothing invasive, nothing about anyone's personal life beyond what touched the business and the money. Marcus pulled public records first, property records showing Karen had taken out a small home equity loan on her condo 8 months earlier, and bank deposit patterns from her property management side business that showed unusually large cash deposits in 3 of the last 5 months, deposits that did not match any rental income she had reported to her own accountant, according to records Preston was able to subpoena once the estate dispute became formal. He also found something through the security company that serviced Richard's home office at the lake house, a separate property from where Karen and I both lived, where Richard kept a small filing cabinet and a home safe for business documents. The lake house had a video doorbell and an interior motion camera in the office hallway, installed 18 months earlier after a break-and scare in the neighborhood, and the footage, still stored on a 30-day rolling cloud account that Richard had never gotten around to canceling, only went back so far, but it went back far enough. It showed Karen entering the lake house alone on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before Richard's death, using a key that she should not have had, carrying a manila folder in when she arrived, and a slightly thicker one when she left 41 minutes later. Time-stamped, dated, unedited, sitting in a cloud account with a login only Richard and I had access to. I watched that clip 11 times in one sitting, and I did not cry once, because somewhere in those 11 viewings, the last soft, hoping part of me finally accepted what my sister actually was. Marcus also found something that connected the dots in a way I had not expected. He located Curtis Boone, the notary whose real commission had been used on the forged document, and Curtis, once he understood he was facing potential license revocation over a document he had never actually notarized, was extremely cooperative. He confirmed his commission number had been used without his knowledge, and when Marcus showed him a photograph of Karen, provided through Preston with appropriate legal authorization, Curtis said he recognized her. That a woman matching her description had come into a print and notary shop he used to work part-time at, 11 months earlier, asking general questions about how notary seals and commission numbers were formatted on legal documents. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time. People ask questions in notary shops all the time. He remembered her because she'd complimented his tie. That single detail, small, human, almost funny in how mundane it was, became one of the most damning pieces of the entire file, because it placed Karen physically at a location studying exactly the kind of technical detail someone would need to forge a convincing notary seal. Months before the will, she presented me claim to have been signed. Preston also brought in a forensic accountant named Priya Nathan, a soft-spoken woman who spent most of her career untangling small business books for exactly this kind of dispute. To look at the property management accounts Karen ran on the side, the same accounts Marcus had already flagged for unusual cash deposits. Priya's report, delivered 2 weeks later in plain, careful language designed for a courtroom rather than a kitchen table, showed that 3 tenants Karen listed as paying rent in cash had, according to their own bank statements obtained through a proper subpoena, actually paid by check or direct deposit into an account that did not match the numbers Karen had reported to her accountant that year. The difference between what those tenants actually paid and what Karen reported lined up, almost to the dollar, with the home equity loan payments on her condo during the same months, suggesting she had been quietly padding her own income on paper, while the real money moved somewhere else entirely. Priya was careful to say, in her report and later in a brief recorded statement Preston took for the file, that she could not speak to intent, only to numbers, but the numbers told a very specific, very unflattering story all on their own. I remember sitting in Preston's office reading that report and feeling something shift in me that had nothing to do with anger anymore. It was the particular hollow clarity of watching a person you grew up with become smaller and smaller with every page, not because I was making her smaller, but because she had spent years quietly making herself that way, one careful lie at a time, long before I ever picked up a phone and started asking questions. Also learned, almost as a footnote in Marcus's timeline, that Karen had opened a new bank account in a different city 11 months before Richard's death, the same city where Curtis Boone's print and notary shop was located, a detail that on its own proved nothing, but sitting next to everything else, proved almost everything. While all of this was being assembled, Karen was not staying quiet. She started calling family members, telling them a softened, sympathetic version of events, that she felt terrible bringing up Tyler's paternity so soon, after the funeral, but that she owed it to her son to make sure he was taken care of the way his father would have wanted, that she hoped I would do the right thing and not make this ugly, that grief makes people do things they regret, and she hoped I wouldn't be one of those people. She was performing generosity while quietly asking my aunt, my cousin and Richard's business partner Dawn Whitcomb, for support in advance of what she framed as a simple, fair correction to an oversight in Richard's estate planning. Dawn called me directly, uncomfortable, clearly caught in the middle, and told me Karen had asked him if the business could accommodate a 40% transfer to a minor beneficiary, and had asked him not to mention the conversation to me yet, because she wanted to handle it delicately. I thanked Dawn for telling me, and I asked him one favor. I asked him to simply document, in an email to himself with a timestamp, exactly what Karen had said and when. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just a factual record, the same way I was building one. He did, without hesitation, because Dawn had known Richard for 18 years and had a nose for when something didn't smell right. There was a family group chat, the kind every extended family has, mostly used for birthday reminders and holiday planning, that Karen had used in the days right after the funeral to gently build sympathy for her position, posting things like, please just pray for peace and clarity for our family right now, and Diane and I will figure this out together. I know she'll do the right thing. I never once responded in that chat while I was building my file because I had learned that responding to a performance only gives it a bigger stage. Once Preston's probate notice was formally filed and the existence of the forensic report became part of the public court record, my cousin, who had been quietly watching that group chat the entire time, sent a single message that read, has anyone actually seen the will Karen keeps talking about, or just her talking about it? No one answered right away. 3 days later, once word had started moving through the family the way it always does, in careful phone calls and half-finished sentences, Aunt Rosalind wrote in that same chat that she had spoken to Preston's office directly, and confirmed there was an active forgery investigation tied to a document Karen had presented, and that she thought everyone should hold off on taking sides until the facts were fully out. Karen left the group chat that same night, without a message. And I remember staring at the little notification that said Karen Ashford left the group, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not triumph, but something closer to grief for a version of my sister that maybe never actually existed outside of my own willingness to keep excusing her. Preston, meanwhile, filed the appropriate notice with the probate court, formally submitting the original verified will for probate and flagging, through proper legal channels, the existence of a second document purporting to be a later will, along with Louise's forensic examination request already in motion. This is the part I want you to really hear, because it is the difference between revenge and consequence. I never once broke into anything. I never hacked an account, never followed Karen, never confronted Tyler, who was, in all of this, an innocent 17-year-old boy who had been handed a story about his own identity by a mother who saw him less as a son and more as a lever. Every single piece of evidence I gathered came through a licensed professional, a subpoena, a public record, or a camera that had been legally installed on property that belonged to my husband and now, to me. Karen was building her case out of performance. I was building mine out of paper. 3 weeks after the funeral, Karen requested what she called a family meeting at Preston's office, framing it to the rest of the family as a chance for everyone to come together and hear about Richard's true wishes for his son, in a calm, mediated setting, with the family lawyer present to make everything official and fair. She invited my mother, my Aunt Rosalind, Don Whitcomb from the business, and at her insistence, Tyler himself, so that, in her words, he could finally hear the truth about his father spoken plainly instead of in whispers. I said yes immediately. I did not tell her why. I was so willing. Preston's conference room has a long oak table and a wall of windows looking out over a parking lot. Nothing dramatic, nothing built for theater, which made it the perfect place for what was about to happen, because nothing about what I brought into that room needed theater to work. Karen arrived 12 minutes late, which I now understand was intentional. A small performance of a woman so overwhelmed by grief and responsibility that she couldn't even manage her own schedule. She wore soft gray, the color of quiet dignity, and she held Tyler's hand as they walked in, and she looked at me with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and faintly triumphant at the same time. The look of someone who believes they have already won and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. My mother sat beside her, already dabbing at her eyes. Aunt Rosalind sat with her arms crossed, uncertain which sister to look at. Don sat near the window, jaw tight, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Preston opened the meeting the way he opens everything, dry, measured, unhurried. He said, before anyone shares their personal feelings about this situation, I want to walk through the documents because that's what a probate proceeding is actually made of. Documents, not feelings, however real those feelings are. Karen said that was fine, that she welcomed transparency, and she slid her folded paper across the table toward Preston with the calm confidence of someone who had rehearsed this exact motion in a mirror. Preston did not touch it right away. He opened a folder of his own instead, and took out 3 documents, laying them side by side, the original will from his own files, Louise Farrow's forensic report with her license number printed at the top, and a single still frame from the lake house camera footage, time-stamped, and dated, showing Karen entering the office alone with an empty folder and leaving with a full one. I watched Karen's face when she saw that photograph. It did not crumble immediately. It did something smaller and, to me, far more telling. It went completely still, the way a person goes still when they are recalculating in real time whether the room they're standing in still belongs to them. Preston spoke slowly. And I want to give you his words as close to exactly as I remember them because he did not raise his voice once. He said, Karen, the document you provided to Diane uses a notary commission number belonging to a licensed notary named Curtis Boone, who has confirmed on record that he never notarized this will and never met either Richard or Diane Whitfield. He said the paper stock this document is printed on did not exist, according to the manufacturer, until 14 months after the date typed at the top of the page. He said, security footage from the property where the original estate documents were stored shows you entering that office alone, using a key you were never issued, 3 weeks before Richard's death. He said, I want to be very clear with everyone in this room that what we are looking at is not a family disagreement about fairness. It is a forged legal instrument. And forging a will is not a civil matter. You can simply apologize your way out of. It is a felony. My mother made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a word that never finished forming. Aunt Rosalind uncrossed her arms and moved them protectively toward Tyler, who was staring at his mother with the particular, devastating blankness of a teenager watching an adult's careful story fall apart in real time. Karen tried to speak. She said the notary thing must have been a mistake by whoever she'd hired to help her file the paperwork. She said she didn't understand anything about paper stock, that this all sounded like some kind of technical trap. She said the important thing, the only thing that actually mattered, was that Tyler was Richard's son, and that fact didn't disappear just because of some paperwork issue. This is the part where I finally spoke, and I want you to know I had planned exactly 4 sentences, because I had learned over 4 weeks of watching Karen perform that the person holding real evidence never needs to raise their voice or use very many words. Said, Karen, I am not disputing that Tyler might be Richard's son. I said, if that's true, I will support a legitimate paternity claim through the proper legal process, because Tyler didn't ask to be born into any of this, and none of what you did is his fault, I said. But you didn't bring me a paternity claim. I said, you brought me a forged will. And now we're going to let the people whose actual job it is to deal with forged wills handle the rest of this conversation. Preston slid one more piece of paper across the table, a formal referral he had already prepared for the district attorney's office, forgery, and attempted fraud upon an estate being matters that fall squarely under criminal, not civil jurisdiction once a licensed forensic examiner's report and law enforcement adjacent evidence, like the notary confirmation, exist. He told Karen, gently but without any softness in the outcome, that the probate court would be formally notified of the forged document as part of the estate proceedings, that Curtis Boone's notary board complaint was already filed independently of anything Karen did or didn't cooperate with, and that whether the district attorney chose to pursue charges was now entirely out of everyone's hands in this room, including mine. Don Whitcomb spoke for the first time, quiet, careful, but final. He said, Karen, given everything on this table, I'm going to need to formally document our earlier conversation about the business transfer for the partnership's records. And I'll be recommending the partnership file its own statement with the court regarding the attempted transfer of a business interest based on a fraudulent instrument. That was the moment Karen understood that the family meeting she had called to gather an audience for her version of the story had instead assembled every single person with the authority to end it. There was no shouting. I want to be honest with you about that. Because a lot of these stories end in a screaming match, and this one didn't, and I think that's part of why it stayed with me the way it has. Karen sat very still for almost a full minute, staring at the photograph of herself entering the lake house, and then she said very quietly, I just wanted him to have something. I said, he can have something, Karen. He can have the truth and a legitimate legal process. And a mother who doesn't ask him to carry a forged document into a room full of family. That's what he can have. What he can't have is a stake in a business built on a felony. Tyler stood up then, 17 years old, and walked out of the conference room without a word to anyone. And Aunt Rosalind went after him. And I remember thinking, in that strange, suspended way you notice small mercies in the middle of a collapse, that at least someone in that room went to check on the actual child in all of this instead of the adult who had used him. My mother finally spoke, her voice small in a way I had genuinely never heard from her before. She asked Karen directly in front of everyone if any of it was true, the notary, the footage, the money. Karen did not answer right away. She looked at the still frame of herself walking into the lake house office for a long moment, and then, she said quietly, I didn't think anyone would ever actually check. That sentence landed harder in that room than anything Preston had read off his documents, because it wasn't a denial, and it wasn't an explanation. It was simply the truth of how she had operated inside our family for as long as I could remember. A quiet, confident bet that no one loved themselves enough to ever ask her to show her work. Don stood up, gathered his copy of the file Preston had prepared for the partnership, and said he needed to step out and make a call, and I understood, watching him go, that whatever protection Karen had ever had inside Richard's business world had just walked out that door with him. Aunt Rosalind came back into the room a few minutes later without Tyler, said he was sitting in the lobby and didn't want to be near any of us right now, and honestly, I didn't blame him. I looked at Karen one last time before Preston moved the meeting into its final procedural stretch, the reading of next steps, the explanation of what would now happen with the court and the notary board and the district attorney's office, and for the first time in my entire life, I did not feel the old pull to make her feel better about the moment she was in. I simply let her sit inside the consequence of it, the way she had let me sit inside so many consequences that were never mine to carry. In the weeks that followed, the forged will was formally rejected by the probate court, and the original document was accepted without contest, since Karen, facing an active forensic report, a notary board complaint, and a pending district attorney referral, had no realistic path to challenge it and no attorney willing to help her try. The district attorney's office reviewed the file Preston submitted and ultimately charged Karen with 1 count of forgery and 1 count of attempted fraud, both tied to the falsified will. And while I won't turn this into a courtroom drama with a verdict announcement, because the legal process moved slowly and quietly, the way these things actually do, I can tell you that Karen entered a plea agreement. That included restitution, probation, and a permanent mark on a record that had, until that year, been spotless. The notary board formally investigated Curtis Boone's complaint, confirmed his commission number had been misappropriated, and referred the underlying forgery to the same criminal file already building against Karen. Whitfield Commercial Properties issued a formal statement to its partners and lenders, not naming Karen publicly, simply confirming that an attempted, fraudulent claim against the company had been identified, investigated, and resolved through proper legal channels, and that the company's ownership structure remained fully intact and uncontested. Don Whitcomb personally called me after that statement went out and said quietly, "Richard would be proud of how you handled this," and I let myself cry for the first time in almost a month, not because of Karen, but because someone had finally said my husband's name in the middle of all this mess and meant something gentle by it. As for Tyler, I want to tell you something that matters more to me than anything that happened to Karen. A separate, legitimate paternity process was initiated through the proper legal channels, quietly, respectfully, without cameras or forged paper anywhere near it, because that boy deserved an actual answer to an actual question about his own life, delivered through a process that wasn't built on a lie. Whatever that answer turns out to be, and I won't share the private details of a minor's paternity case here, I told Tyler directly, in a phone call his mother knew nothing about until after it happened, that he was welcome in my life regardless of what any test confirmed, because he never forged anything, he never lied to anyone. He was just a kid who got handed a folder by someone who should have protected him instead of using him. He cried on that call. I did too. That felt like the only part of this entire story that had nothing to do with revenge at all. I changed the locks on the lake house within a week of that conference room meeting, not out of anger, but out of the same plane. Practical instinct that makes you replace a broken lock after you learn someone's had an unauthorized key. The security company reissued new credentials, and I personally deleted every old access code from the system, including the one Karen had apparently been using since some point none of us can fully reconstruct, and probably never will, and honestly, I've stopped needing to know. My mother and I don't talk the way we used to. She still, on some level, wants me to forgive quickly, to smooth this over the way our family always smoothed everything over, but I've noticed she doesn't sigh at me anymore when I say no. Maybe that's its own small, strange kind of progress. The house is quiet now in a way I didn't expect grief to sound like. Not sad quiet. Settled quiet. I sit at that same kitchen table some evenings with a cup of tea, in the exact chair I was sitting in when Karen unfolded that piece of paper, and I think about how close I came to simply accepting it, the way I accepted the locket, the way I let go of $4,000, the way I stopped asking questions about a casserole dish that never existed. I don't think what I did was revenge, and I want to be honest with you about the difference, because I think it matters more than the story itself. Revenge would have been posting that camera footage online before the estate process even started, humiliating Karen in front of strangers for the satisfaction of watching it happen. Revenge would have been telling Tyler the ugliest possible version of his mother, the moment I found out what she'd done, using a child's pain as a weapon, the way she tried to use his existence as one. What I did instead was simpler, and honestly, slower, and less satisfying in the moment than revenge would have felt. I just stopped absorbing the cost of other people's choices and let the truth, fully documented, properly verified, legally submitted, do the only kind of talking that actually holds up once the performance stops. Self-respect, I've learned, rarely looks dramatic while it's happening. It looks like phone calls to attorneys. It looks like sitting quietly through a forensic report instead of yelling across a table. It looks like changing a lock and not feeling the need to explain why to anyone who already knows. For a long time, I thought boundaries were something you announced. A big dramatic sentence you finally worked up the courage to say out loud at exactly the right moment, the kind of line people practice in the mirror. What I learned sitting in that conference room is that real boundaries are usually quieter than that and much less satisfying to imagine in advance. A boundary is a phone call to a forensic accountant instead of a screaming match at a funeral reception. A boundary is refusing to respond in a group chat designed to build sympathy before the facts are even out. Boundary is looking at your own mother's sigh and, for the first time, not rearranging your entire life around avoiding it. I think about Karen sometimes, late at night, in the particular quiet that settles into a house once the casseroles are gone and the sympathy cards have stopped arriving. I don't think she woke up one day and decided to become someone who would forge her dead brother-in-law's signature. Think she woke up thousands of small mornings across our whole childhood, watching a locket get handed to her because she cried the loudest, watching $4,000 disappear into a debt no one ever made her repay, watching our mother sigh at the sister who dared to ask for fairness instead of at the one who never had to. None of that excuses what she did. It only explains it. And I've come to believe those are two very different things that we owe ourselves the discipline to keep separate. What she did was a choice, made by an adult, with a notary's stolen commission number and a piece of paper bought from a print shop, and choices like that have consequences that exist entirely independent of whatever pain built the person who made them. So here's what I want to ask you, because I think this is the real question underneath every story like this one. Where is the line for you? Between keeping the peace and quietly disappearing a little more every time someone you love decides your boundaries are optional. And once you find that line, what does it actually take for you to finally stop moving it for other people? Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of this one. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments what you would have done differently sitting at that kitchen table. I read every single one.